There's nothing quite like the pain of losing a parent you never really knew. For 30 years, Catherine Brennan carried the weight of her father's abandonment, believing he chose whiskey and the mountains over his own daughter. Now, standing in a lawyer's office with his final letter in her trembling hands, she discovers he left her something she never expected, a remote cabin deep in the Colorado wilderness. The problem is, nobody knows where it is. Nobody, except Cyrus Dalton, a gruff mountain man who once rode with her father decades ago. He agrees to guide her through the forgotten trails to find this mysterious inheritance. But as they venture deeper into the untamed wilderness, Catherine begins to sense this journey will reveal more than just an old cabin. What secrets did her father hide in those mountains, and why did he wait until death to bring her home? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Catherine Brennan had always believed that libraries were the safest places in the world. Between the orderly rows of books and the predictable silence, she had built a life that asked nothing unexpected of her. At 52, she moved through her days with the careful precision of someone who had learned early that disappointment was best avoided by expecting little. The call from the lawyer had come on a Tuesday morning while she was cataloguing returns. Her father, Benjamin Brennan, was dead. She hadn't spoken to him in 30 years, hadn't even known where he was living. The lawyer's voice was kind but businesslike as he explained about the will, about property in Colorado, about arrangements that needed to be made. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mrs. Brennan," he had said, and Catherine had almost laughed. How do you lose something you never really had? Now, 3 days later, she sat across from Mr. Harrison in 12, his wood-paneled office, staring at documents that made no sense. Her father had owned land. Not just any land, hundreds of acres in the Colorado wilderness, complete with a cabin and what the deed vaguely described as improvements and structures thereon. "I don't understand," Catherine said, touching the worn photograph that had been tucked inside the envelope. The man in the picture looked nothing like the broken drunk she remembered. This man stood tall and confident, his eyes clear and purposeful. "This isn't the father I knew." Mr. Harrison adjusted his glasses and leaned forward. "Your father was quite specific about his instructions, Mrs. Brennan. He wanted you to have this property, but he also knew you'd need help finding it. The cabin is in a very remote location, accessible only by trails that aren't on any modern maps. Then how am I supposed to—" He arranged for a guide, a Mr. Cyrus Dalton. "He's been contacted and is expecting your call." Catherine stared at the photograph again. Her father looked to be in his 30s, wearing clothes that suggested outdoor work, standing beside what appeared to be a mining operation. Behind him, mountains stretched toward a vast sky. She had never seen this version of her father, the confident man who seemed to belong in that wild landscape. Her memories were different. Whiskey on his breath when he tucked her in at night, if he remembered to do it at all. Her mother's tears after another late night, another empty promise broken. The way the house grew quieter and quieter until one day he simply wasn't there anymore. No goodbye, no explanation, just gone. "Mrs. Brennan?" Mr. Harrison's voice pulled her back to the present. "Would you like me to call Mr. Dalton for you?" She almost said no, almost walked out of that office and back to her safe, predictable life among the books. But something in the photograph stopped her, maybe the way her father's hand rested on what looked like a surveyor's tool, or the sense of purpose in his stance. This wasn't the aimless drifter her mother had described. An hour later, she was sitting in a small cafe, waiting for Cyrus Dalton. She spotted him the moment he walked in, a man in his late 60s, weathered by decades of sun and wind, moving with the careful economy of someone accustomed to rough terrain. His grey hair was pulled back in a ponytail, and his clothes were clean but bore the unmistakable signs of a life spent outdoors. He slid into the booth across from her without ceremony. "You look like him," he said simply. "Around the eyes." Catherine didn't know how to respond to that. Mr. Dalton, I appreciate you agreeing to help, but I have to ask, how well did you really know my father? Cyrus was quiet for a long moment, studying her face. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of careful consideration. Ben Brennan saved my life twice. Once during the war, once after. I owed him more than I could ever repay. The war. Korea. We served together, came home together, stayed friends after. He paused, seeming to weigh his words. Your father was a good man, Catherine. Whatever you think you know about him, whatever your mother told you, there was more to the story. Catherine felt a familiar anger rising in her chest. My mother told me he was a drunk who abandoned his family. Are you saying that wasn't true? I'm saying a man can be more than one thing, Cyrus replied quietly. Ben struggled. Yes, but he never stopped loving you and your mother. Everything he did, especially at the end, was about protecting you. Protecting us? He left us. Cyrus nodded slowly. He did, and it near killed him to do it. The certainty in his voice unsettled her. For 30 years, Catherine had carried her anger like a shield. It protected her from hoping for things that might disappoint her, from trusting people who might leave. Now, this stranger was suggesting that everything she believed might be wrong. The cabin, she said, changing the subject. How far is it? 3 days on horseback, if the weather holds. It's rough country, no roads, no cell service once we get past the first ridge. You ever done any camping? Catherine almost laughed. I'm a librarian, Mr. Dalton. The wildest thing I do is reorganize the fiction section. Something that might have been a smile flickered across his weathered features. Ben said you were smart, said you got that from him, the thinking things through. We'll take it slow, make sure you're ready for each day before we start it. What if I can't do it? What if I'm not strong enough? Your father thought you were stronger than you knew, Cyrus said. Guess we'll find out if he was right. That evening, Catherine sat in her small apartment, surrounded by camping gear she'd purchased in a daze of determination and doubt. The salesman at the outdoor store had been enthusiastic and helpful, but everything felt foreign in her hands. The sleeping bag, the hiking boots, the backpack that seemed designed for someone far more adventurous than she had ever been. She picked up her father's letter again, reading the words that had started this whole impossible journey. Katie, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you're probably angry. You have every right to be. I know what you think of me, and I know your mother told you I was no good. Maybe I wasn't, in the ways that mattered most. But there are things you don't know, things I couldn't tell you without putting you in danger. The cabin is yours now, and everything in it. Cyrus will help you find it. What you do after that is up to you, but I hope you'll understand that everything I did for love. Even leaving. Especially leaving. Your father, Ben. The handwriting was shaky but determined, and she could see places where he had pressed too hard with the pen, as if the words were difficult to form. At the bottom, almost as an afterthought, he had added, You're stronger than you know, Katie girl. You always were. Katie girl. She hadn't been called that since she was 7 years old. Catherine closed her eyes and tried to remember her father's voice saying those words, but all she could recall were the slurred promises and the smell of whiskey. Yet here was evidence of a different man, one who had planned for her future, who had arranged for her safety, who had trusted someone like Cyrus Dalton to help her when she needed it. She walked to her bedroom window and looked out at the city lights of Denver. Tomorrow, she would meet Cyrus at dawn and begin a journey into country she had never imagined visiting. She would leave behind her comfortable routine, her safe job, her predictable life, and venture into a wilderness that had somehow been part of her inheritance all along. For the first time in years, Catherine felt something stirring inside her that might have been excitement. Or maybe it was fear. At her age, perhaps they were the same thing. She pulled the photograph from the envelope again and studied her father's face. In the morning light that filtered through the image, she could see something she had missed before: a small scar along his jawline, and beyond that, the suggestion of someone watching from the shadows behind him. This wasn't just a casual snapshot. Someone had been documenting something important. Catherine set the photograph on her nightstand, where she could see it from her bed. Tomorrow, she would begin to discover who her father really was. Tonight, she would try to let go of who she had always believed him to be. Outside her window, the mountains rose dark against the stars, holding secrets she was finally ready to learn. The horses were waiting at dawn, their breath visible in the crisp mountain air. Catherine had never been this close to a horse before, and the mare Cyrus had chosen for her seemed impossibly large and unpredictable. Her name was Sage, and she had gentle eyes that Catherine tried to find reassuring. "She'll take care of you," Cyrus said, adjusting the stirrups with practiced efficiency. "Your father rode her a few times. She knows the trails." Catherine accepted his help mounting, grateful for his steadying hand as she found her balance. The world looked different from horseback, both higher and more precarious than she had expected. Cyrus swung onto his own mount, a sturdy gelding named Buck, with the ease of someone who had been doing it for 50 years. They rode through the outskirts of the small mountain town in comfortable silence, leaving behind the last vestiges of civilization as the trail began to climb. Catherine focused on staying upright and following Cyrus's example, trying not to think about how far they were from any kind of help. The first few hours passed in a blur of unfamiliar sensations: the creak of leather, the steady rhythm of Sage's gait, the way the mountain air seemed to fill her lungs more completely than any breath she had taken in years. When they stopped for lunch beside a clear stream, Catherine was surprised to realize she felt invigorated rather than exhausted. "You're doing better than expected," Cyrus observed, handing her a sandwich from his saddlebags. "Most city folks are complaining by now." Catherine laughed, surprising herself. "Give me time. The day is young." As they ate, she studied the hand-drawn map her father had left. The lines and symbols meant nothing to her, but Cyrus traced their route with his finger, pointing out landmarks and explaining the terrain ahead. "This isn't exactly a casual weekend cabin, is it?" Catherine asked, noting how the trail seemed to wind deeper and deeper into unmarked territory. "No," Cyrus agreed. "Ben chose this location for privacy, real privacy, the kind where nobody finds you unless you want them to." "Why would he need that kind of privacy?" Cyrus was quiet for a long moment, studying the water as it flowed over the rocks. "Your father had some troubles after the war. Not the drinking kind, though, that was part of it. The kind where certain people held grudges." Catherine felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "What kind of people?" "The kind that prey on folks who can't protect themselves. Ben had a way of evening those odds." Before Catherine could ask what that meant, Cyrus was already repacking their lunch and preparing to mount up again. But as they continued up the trail, his words echoed in her mind. What had her father been involved in that required this level of isolation? The afternoon brought them to higher elevation, where the trees grew thicker and the trail became less distinct. Several times, Cyrus had to dismount to check for markers that Catherine couldn't see: scratches on rocks, arrangements of stones that looked random to her untrained eye. "How do you know we're going the right way?" she asked during one of these stops. "Your father taught me to read his signs," Cyrus replied, pointing to what appeared to be an ordinary pile of rocks. "See how that top stone is turned just so. And there," he indicated a tree trunk marked with what looked like natural scarring. "That's not from weather." Catherine began to understand that her father had created an entire communication system, a way of marking territory and leaving messages that only certain people could read. The implications were both impressive and unsettling. As evening approached, they made camp in a small clearing protected by towering pines. Cyrus handled most of the work, building a fire, preparing food, setting up their sleeping areas, while Catherine watched and tried to help where she could. The routine felt ancient and purposeful in a way her city life never had. "Tell me about him," she said as they sat by the fire, the darkness pressing close around their small circle of light. "Tell me about the man you knew." Cyrus poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks, spiraling up toward the stars. Ben was the kind of man who couldn't walk away from trouble, especially when it involved folks who couldn't handle it themselves. After the war, he came back, changed, we all did. But instead of trying to forget what he'd learned about fighting, he used it to help people. Help them how? There were gangs operating in these mountains back then. Men who would rob settlers, attack isolated homesteads, take what they wanted, and disappear into the wilderness. The law couldn't touch them, too much territory, not enough men. So Ben and a few others decided to handle it themselves. Catherine stared into the flames, trying to reconcile this image with her memories. He was some kind of vigilante. He was a protector, Cyrus said firmly. Everything legal and above board, mostly. He worked with the territorial marshal when there was one, on his own when there wasn't. The point was keeping innocent people safe. Then why did he leave us? If he was such a protector, why didn't he protect his own family? Cyrus was quiet for so long that Catherine thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with old sadness. Because the last gang he went after didn't just threaten him, Catherine. They threatened you and your mother specifically, by name. Ben had two choices, stay and fight, putting you in danger, or leave and draw them away from you. The words hit Catherine like a physical blow. All these years, she had believed her father abandoned them for selfish reasons. The possibility that he had sacrificed everything to protect them turned her understanding of her own life upside down. You're saying he chose exile to keep us safe? I'm saying he chose the hardest thing a man can choose. He gave up everything that mattered to him to make sure you lived to grow up safely. Catherine stood abruptly and walked to the edge of their firelight, staring out into the darkness. Somewhere in these mountains, her father had built a new life in isolation, carrying the weight of a choice that must have tortured him every day. And she had spent 30 years hating him for it. "Catherine," Cyrus called softly, "there's something else you should know. We're not the only ones who know about this cabin." She turned back to face him. "What do you mean?" "I've been seeing signs all day. Horse tracks that don't belong to us, broken branches at the wrong height, camps that are too clean. Someone else is in these mountains, and they're following the same trail we are." "Following us?" "Following the route to your father's cabin. They've been out here for days, maybe weeks, working their way toward the same destination." Catherine felt her heart begin to race. "Who would be looking for the cabin?" "That," Cyrus said, standing and checking his rifle with practiced efficiency, "is what we need to find out. But Catherine, whatever happens, when we reach that cabin, you need to understand that your father prepared for this. Everything he did, every choice he made, was thinking ahead to the day when you might need to finish what he started." As Catherine settled into her sleeping bag that night, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the wilderness around her, she realized that this journey was far more than a simple inheritance. Her father had left her more than property. He had left her a legacy that she was only beginning to understand. And somewhere in the darkness, unknown enemies were moving toward the same destination, carrying intentions she could only guess at. For the first time since leaving Denver, Catherine wondered if she was strong enough for what lay ahead. But as she drifted off to sleep, she found herself thinking not about her own doubts, but about her father's faith that she could handle whatever was waiting in that remote cabin. Tomorrow, they would ride deeper into his world, and closer to answers that might change everything she thought she knew about. Courage, sacrifice, and love. The second day dawned clear and cold, with frost coating their sleeping bags and the horse's breath creating small clouds in the mountain air. Catherine woke feeling muscles she had forgotten she possessed, but also with a surprising sense of accomplishment. She had survived her first night in the wilderness. Cyrus was already up, moving quietly around their camp with the efficiency of long practice. He had coffee brewing over the rekindled fire and was checking their gear with methodical care. "Sleep well?" he asked, as Catherine emerged from her sleeping bag, trying not to groan at the stiffness in her legs. "Better than expected," she admitted, accepting a cup of the strong coffee gratefully. "Though I think Sage might be judging my riding technique." "She's patient," Cyrus said, with something that might have been a smile. "Your father wasn't much of a horseman when he started either. Took him months to stop looking like a sack of grain tied to the saddle." Catherine found herself hungry for these small details about her father's life, the ordinary struggles that made him seem more human, more real than the distant figure of her memories. They broke camp and continued climbing, the trail growing steeper and more challenging. Catherine's confidence from the previous day was tested as Sage picked her way carefully along narrow ledges and across creek beds swollen with snowmelt. But gradually, she began to trust both the horse and her own ability to adapt. Around midday, Cyrus called a halt near what appeared to be an unremarkable boulder formation. But as Catherine watched, he began moving stones with deliberate purpose, revealing a hidden cache beneath. "Your father left supplies along this route," he explained, pulling out a waterproof container. "Food, ammunition, other necessities." He wanted to make sure anyone following his path would be prepared for what they might find. Inside the container, Catherine discovered not just practical supplies, but a leather-bound journal with her name written on the cover. Her hands trembled as she opened it to find her father's familiar handwriting. "Katie, if you're reading this, then Cyrus has brought you safely this far. I'm proud of you for making this journey. I know it can't be easy, leaving your comfortable life to chase after a father who disappointed you. But I need you to understand something important. Everything I did was to protect you and your mother. The choice to leave was the hardest thing I ever did, but it was necessary. There are men in this world who prey on the innocent, and I spent years making sure they could never hurt my family. That work cost me everything that mattered, but it was worth it to know you were safe. What you'll find at the cabin will explain everything. Until then, trust Cyrus. He's the best man I ever knew. Your loving father, Ben." Catherine read the entry twice, then closed the journal and held it against her chest. For 30 years, she had carried the weight of feeling unwanted, unloved, forgotten. These words, written in her father's careful script and hidden along a trail only she would travel, began to heal wounds she had thought were permanent. "He planned this," she said, looking up at Cyrus. "All of this. The journey, the supplies, even knowing I would need to hear these words at exactly this moment." Ben was always thinking 3 steps ahead, Cyrus agreed. Had to be, in his line of work. But this, he gestured to the journal in her hands, this was personal. He spent years working out every detail of how to get you safely to the cabin and back. What was he so afraid of? What kind of men were threatening us? Cyrus repacked the remaining supplies and sealed the cache again, his movements careful and deliberate. The worst kind, men who saw other people's suffering as entertainment, who took what they wanted without regard for the consequences. Your father and a few others decided that the law wasn't enough to stop them. So he became the law himself? He became justice, Cyrus corrected. There's a difference. Everything he did was about protecting innocent people, families like yours, who just wanted to live in peace. As they continued up the trail, Catherine found herself seeing the landscape differently. What had seemed like empty wilderness the day before now revealed itself as carefully chosen defensive terrain. Her father hadn't just hidden in these mountains, he had turned them into a fortress. The afternoon brought them to a series of switchbacks that climbed along an exposed ridge. Catherine's fear of heights battled with her growing determination not to disappoint the father she was finally beginning to understand. When Sage hesitated at a particularly narrow section, Catherine found the confidence to urge her forward with gentle pressure and encouraging words. "You're getting the hang of this," Cyrus observed as they paused to rest at the top of the ridge. "Your father said you were stubborn when you set your mind to something. He told you about me, talked about you all the time. How proud he was when you graduated high school, when you got married, when your children were born. He kept track of your life, Catherine, even if he couldn't be part of it. The revelation was both comforting and heartbreaking. While she had been hating him for his absence, he had been loving her from a distance, following her life's milestones with the devotion of a father who had never stopped caring. That evening, they camped in a protected valley where a natural spring provided fresh water. As Cyrus prepared their meal, Catherine explored the area and discovered evidence of previous camps, fire rings carefully constructed and concealed, food caches hidden with the same methodical precision they had found earlier. "He came here often," she said when she returned to their fire. This was one of his regular stops. Ben would come up here when he needed to think, to plan, sometimes just to remember what he was fighting for. Cyrus handed her a plate of beans and hardtack. "He showed me a picture once you at your high school graduation. Said it was worth every sacrifice to see you grow up safe and strong." Catherine felt tears threatening and turned away to compose herself. The image of her father sitting alone by this same fire, looking at her graduation photo and convincing himself that his exile was worthwhile, was almost too painful to bear. "Cyrus," she said finally, "what happened to the men who threatened us? The ones who drove him away? Some of them Ben dealt with himself. Others scattered when they realized they were being hunted. But the leader, a man named Marcus Reynolds, he escaped into Mexico. Ben spent years trying to track him down. Did he find him?" Cyrus stared into the fire, his weathered face grim. "That's a story for when we reach the cabin. Some truths are better told in the place where they happened." As Catherine settled into her sleeping bag that night, she found herself thinking about the journal entry and the careful way her father had planned for this moment. He had known she would need encouragement at exactly this point in the journey, when the physical challenges were testing her resolve and the emotional revelations were overwhelming her understanding of the past. Tomorrow would bring them closer to the cabin and to answers that she both craved and feared. But tonight, for the first time in 30 years, Catherine fell asleep, feeling truly connected to her father, not as the broken man who had left her, but as the protector who had sacrificed everything to keep her safe. The third day began with a discovery that changed everything Catherine thought she knew about her father. As they broke camp, Cyrus pulled something from his saddlebags that gleamed dully in the morning light, a tarnished silver medal attached to a faded ribbon. "Your father asked me to give this to you when we got close to the cabin," he said, placing it carefully in her hands. "Said you'd earned the right to know the truth about who he really was." Catherine turned the medal over, reading the inscription. "Silver Star, for gallantry in action against an enemy of the United States." Below that, in smaller text, "Sergeant Benjamin Brennan, United States Army, Korea, 1951. "A silver star," she whispered. "He never told us he was decorated. Ben didn't talk much about the war, but he did things over there that saved a lot of lives. When we came home, he couldn't just stop being that man, the one who stood between innocent people and danger." Cyrus began saddling the horses as he spoke, his movements automatic, while his attention remained focused on Catherine's reaction. After Korea, there wasn't much call for that kind of courage in regular life. Ben tried to settle down, tried to be the husband and father your mother wanted. But trouble has a way of finding men like him. Catherine studied her father's medal, trying to imagine the young soldier who had earned it. The man, in her childhood memories, had seemed broken, defeated by life. This medal spoke of someone entirely different, a hero who had risked everything for others. "What kind of trouble?" she asked, mounting sage with growing confidence. "The kind that comes when good men try to protect their communities from predators." Cyrus swung up onto Buck and pointed toward a ridge that rose sharp against the morning sky. "We'll reach the cabin area by evening. But first, there's something else you need to see." They rode steadily upward through terrain that grew increasingly wild and beautiful. Catherine found herself appreciating details she would have missed days earlier, the way the light filtered through the pine branches, the sound of wind moving through the high grass, the sense of space and freedom that came from being so far from any human settlement. Around noon, they reached a plateau where the remains of what had once been a substantial camp were still visible. Stone foundations marked where buildings had stood, and Catherine could see the careful layout of what had been a small community. This was Settlers' Rest, Cyrus explained, dismounting near what appeared to have been the largest structure. About 40 families lived here in the 1,870 seconds and 80 seconds. Good people trying to make honest livings, farmers, craftsmen, a few miners. Catherine walked among the ruins, noting how the stones had been carefully fitted and how the site had been chosen for both beauty and defensibility. What happened to them? The Dawson gang happened, led by a man named Marcus Reynolds, same one I mentioned last night. They specialized in hitting isolated communities, taking everything of value and leaving the survivors with nothing. My father knew about this place. He made it his business to know about places like this. After the war, Ben couldn't stand the thought of good people being preyed upon while he sat safely in town. So he started tracking the gangs, learning their patterns, warning communities when he could. Cyrus led her to a flat stone that bore carved letters, weathered but still readable. In memory of those lost at Settlers' Rest, the 15th of April, 1883. Their sacrifice will not be forgotten. B. Catherine knelt beside her father's memorial, running her fingers over the letters he had carved with his own hands. He came here afterward, many times. Ben made this place his reminder of why the work mattered. When the drinking got bad, when the memories of Korea got too heavy, he'd come here and remember that there were people depending on him to keep the monsters away. They ate lunch in the shadow of the memorial, and Catherine found herself understanding her father's choices in a completely different light. The drinking hadn't been weakness. It had been the weight of carrying too much, a responsibility for too many people's safety. The distance from his family hadn't been abandonment. It had been the recognition that his dangerous work put them at risk. "Cyrus," she said finally, "the letters my father wrote but never sent, where are they?" "At the cabin, along with everything else he wanted you to know." As they continued toward their destination, the trail became less defined and more challenging. Catherine was grateful for the strength she had built over the past 2 days as Sage navigated increasingly difficult terrain. The mountains seemed to close around them, creating a sense of moving deeper into a world that operated by different rules. Late in the afternoon, they reached a vantage point where Cyrus called a halt. Below them, barely visible through the trees, Catherine could see the glint of what might have been a roof. "There," Cyrus pointed, "your father's cabin." Catherine stared at the distant structure, feeling her heart race with anticipation and fear. After 3 days of learning who her father really was, she was finally about to see how he had lived during his years of exile. "Before we go down there," Cyrus said, his voice taking on a serious tone, "you need to understand something. The men we've been tracking, the ones whose signs I've been seeing, they're down there too. Their horses are hidden in that grove to the east." Catherine felt the blood drain from her face. "They found the cabin before us?" "Looks that way." But Catherine, Cyrus reached over and took her hand. "Your father prepared for this possibility. Everything in that cabin, every precaution he took, was planned with the knowledge that someday his enemies might come looking for what he left behind." "What did he leave behind?" "Justice," Cyrus said simply, "and the means for you to finish what he started." As they began the careful descent toward the cabin, Catherine found herself thinking about the Silver Star medal in her pocket and the memorial her father had carved for strangers he had never met. This was a man who had spent his life standing between innocent people and those who would harm them. Now, it seemed, that legacy was about to become hers. The sun was setting behind the mountains as they approached the cabin, and Catherine could smell wood smoke on the evening air. Whoever was waiting for them had made themselves at home in her father's sanctuary. Tomorrow she would discover what they wanted and whether she had inherited more than just her father's property. They approached the cabin in the fading light, moving carefully through the pines that surrounded the small clearing. Catherine's heart pounded as she caught her first clear glimpse of her father's home, a sturdy log structure that seemed to grow naturally from the landscape around it. Smoke rose from the chimney, and golden light spilled from the windows, creating an almost welcoming scene that belied the danger Cyrus had warned her about. "We'll wait until full dark," Cyrus whispered, leading their horses to a concealed spot well back from the clearing. "Then we'll see what we're dealing with." As they settled in to observe, Catherine noticed details that spoke to her father's careful planning. The cabin was positioned to command views of all approaches, with clear fields of fire in every direction. What had appeared to be random boulders around the clearing were actually positioned to provide cover, and she could see evidence of other defensive preparations built into the natural landscape. "How many are there?" she asked, studying the patterns of light and shadow around the building. "3 horses," Cyrus replied. "Probably 3 men, though we can't be certain until we get closer." An hour after sunset, they moved to a position where they could see into the cabin's main room through a gap in the curtains. Catherine watched 3 men moving around inside, rough-looking individuals who clearly weren't there for any peaceful purpose. They were searching through her father's belongings with systematic thoroughness, pulling books from shelves and examining papers by lamplight. "They're looking for something specific," she observed. "Your father's journal," Cyrus confirmed. "The detailed one where he documented everything he learned about the gangs he tracked. Names, locations, evidence of crimes enough to put a lot of dangerous men in prison if it fell into the right hands." Catherine watched the searchers grow, increasingly frustrated as their efforts failed to turn up whatever they sought. The largest of the 3 men, clearly their leader, began issuing sharp orders that carried clearly across the still mountain air. "Where would he hide something that important?" she asked. Cyrus smiled grimly. "Ben was smarter than these fools give him credit for. The real treasures aren't in the cabin at all. They're buried in places only someone with his map could find." As if summoned by their conversation, one of the searchers emerged from the cabin, carrying a familiar-looking object, the same type of waterproof container they had found along the trail. Catherine realized with growing excitement that her father had created multiple caches, each containing pieces of the larger puzzle. "They found one of his hiding spots," she whispered. "But not the right one," Cyrus replied, with satisfaction. "Ben was always thinking 3 steps ahead. What they're finding is what he wanted them to find, enough truth to keep them busy, but not enough to do any real damage." The man with the container returned to the cabin, and Catherine could see him showing its contents to his companions. Even from their distant position, it was clear that whatever he had found was both important and incomplete, valuable enough to encourage continued searching, but frustrating in its lack of final answers. "Cyrus," Catherine said slowly, "my father planned this, didn't he? He wanted these men to come here. Your father knew that Marcus Reynolds would never stop looking for him, and he knew that eventually someone would come for whatever evidence he had gathered. Ben spent his final years turning this entire area into a trap." Catherine studied the cabin with new understanding. Her father hadn't just been hiding here, he had been preparing a final confrontation with the enemies who had driven him into exile. Every defensive position, every hidden cache, every carefully planned detail was part of an elaborate strategy to protect his family while ensuring that justice was finally served. "What's in the real hiding place?" she asked. "Everything needed to destroy what's left of Reynolds' organization. Financial records, witness statements, evidence of crimes going back decades. But more than that," Cyrus turned to meet her eyes, "a complete plan for how to use that evidence to protect other families from what you went through." As they watched, the three men emerged from the cabin and began searching the surrounding area with lanterns. Their movements were methodical, but showed signs of growing desperation. Catherine realized they had been at this for hours, possibly days, without finding what they sought. "They know the journal exists," she said. "Someone told them about it. Reynolds has been planning this for a long time. When Ben died, word got out that he had left evidence behind. These men are just the advance team. Reynolds himself will be coming soon." Catherine felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "You mean the man who threatened my family 30 years ago is still alive?" "Very much alive, and very much interested in making sure your father's evidence never sees the light of day." But Catherine, Cyrus, placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Ben knew this day would come, and he prepared for it. Everything you need is hidden where only you can find it. Me? But I don't know anything about reading his maps or finding his caches. You know more than you think. Remember the photograph your father left, the one that didn't look like the man you remembered? Look at it again, but this time pay attention to what's behind him." Catherine pulled the worn photograph from her pocket and studied it in the moonlight. For the first time, she noticed that the surveyor's tool her father was holding was positioned to point toward something in the background, a distinctive rock formation that looked familiar. "I've seen that formation," she said with growing excitement. "We passed it this afternoon. Your father spent years teaching himself surveying and map-making so he could create a system that only his daughter, a woman raised to notice details and organize information, could decipher. Every clue he left was designed specifically for your skills and knowledge." Catherine looked back toward the cabin, where the searchers continued their frustrated hunt for answers that were hidden in plain sight all around them. Her father hadn't just left her property, he had left her a puzzle that played to her strengths as a librarian and researcher, while remaining incomprehensible to the kind of men who relied on force and intimidation. "Tomorrow," she said quietly, "we're going to find that journal." "Tomorrow," Cyrus agreed. "You're going to finish what your father started." Dawn came grey and cold, with mist rising from the valley floor and obscuring the cabin in ghostly tendrils. Catherine and Cyrus had spent the night taking turns, watching their uninvited guests, who had finally given up their search around midnight and settled into an uneasy sleep inside her father's home. "They'll start again this morning," Cyrus observed quietly as they shared coffee and cold breakfast. "But they're looking in all the wrong places." Catherine studied the photograph again, using the growing light to examine details she had missed in the darkness. The rock formation her father pointed toward was definitely the outcropping they had passed yesterday, but now she could see there was more to the image, subtle markings on the rocks that looked natural but followed too regular a pattern to be coincidence. "He carved directions into the stone," she realized. "Look," she pointed to what appeared to be natural weathering on the rock face. "Those lines aren't random. They're pointing towards something." "Your father always said you had an eye for patterns," Cyrus said with approval. "Most folks would look at that formation 100 times and never see what he hid there." Movement near the cabin caught their attention. The three men were emerging, stretching and preparing for another day of searching. Catherine could see their frustration in the way they moved, short, angry gestures that spoke of men running out of patience and options. "We need to reach that rock formation before they do," she said. "They don't know to look there yet," Cyrus replied. "But you're right, we should move while they're distracted." They worked their way around the valley, staying well clear of the cabin and using the thick forest to mask their movement. The rock formation was about a mile from the cabin, positioned on a small rise that commanded excellent views of the surrounding terrain. As they approached it, Catherine began to understand why her father had chosen this location for whatever he had hidden. The rocks themselves were unremarkable, typical mountain granite, weathered by decades of wind and weather. But as Catherine examined them more closely, she began to see the subtle modifications her father had made. What looked like natural cracks and fissures had been carefully enhanced to create a system of directional markers. "It's like a combination lock," she said, tracing the carved lines with her finger. Each mark points to the next one in sequence. Following the markers led them to a seemingly solid section of rock face. But when Catherine pressed against it in the pattern indicated by the carvings, a section pivoted inward to reveal a hidden chamber. Inside, wrapped in oiled leather and protected by the same type of waterproof container they had found along the trail, was her father's detailed journal, not the simple record they had expected, but a comprehensive documentation of 30 years of investigation and pursuit. "My God," Catherine breathed, opening the journal to pages covered with her father's meticulous handwriting. "This isn't just evidence, it's a complete intelligence report." The journal contained everything Cyrus had promised and more. Financial records showing how Marcus Reynolds had built a criminal empire that stretched across 3 territories. Witness statements from survivors of attacks on isolated communities. Maps showing the locations of hidden caches where stolen goods and money were stored. Most importantly, detailed plans for how all this evidence could be used to destroy Reynolds' organization permanently. But what struck Catherine most deeply were the personal entries scattered throughout the official documentation. Letters addressed to her, written over the course of years, chronicling her father's thoughts and feelings as he pursued his dangerous mission. "Katie, I saw a woman in town today who reminded me of your mother. Same way of holding her head when she was thinking. Same gentle smile. It made me remember our last Christmas together, before everything went wrong. I wanted to write to you then, to try to explain, but I know you're safer not knowing where I am. Someday, when this is all over, I'll find a way to make you understand. Katie, your 30th birthday was last week. I bought a present for you, a music box that plays that lullaby your mother used to sing. It's hidden with the rest of my personal things. I hope someday you'll find it and know that I never forgot. Katie, Cyrus brought me news that you got married. I wanted to be there so badly, it nearly broke my resolve. But Reynolds is still out there, still dangerous, and I won't risk your happiness for my own selfish desires. Your new husband seems like a good man. Be happy, my dear daughter. That's all I ever wanted for you." Catherine wiped away tears as she read entry after entry, documenting her father's love and sacrifice. He had followed her life from a distance, celebrating her victories and mourning his inability to share them with her. Every major decision he made was filtered through the question of how it would affect her safety and happiness. "He never stopped loving us," she said, looking up at Cyrus through her tears. "Never for a moment," Cyrus confirmed. "Ben used to say that love wasn't about being present, it was about making sure the people you cared about could live without fear." As Catherine continued reading, she discovered that her father's final plan was more comprehensive than she had imagined. He hadn't just gathered evidence against Reynolds, he had created a complete strategy for dismantling the entire criminal network while ensuring that other families would be protected from similar threats in the future. "There's a letter here, addressed to the territorial marshal," she said, finding the sealed envelope tucked into the back of the journal, "and another one to a federal judge. He's documented everything in legal language, with witnesses and corroborating evidence. Ben studied law during his final years," Cyrus explained. "Taught himself everything he needed to know to make sure his evidence would hold up in court. This isn't just about revenge, Catherine, it's about justice." A sound from the valley below interrupted their discovery. Looking toward the cabin, they could see the 3 searchers spreading out across the landscape, beginning a more systematic search of the surrounding area. "They're getting desperate," Cyrus observed. "That makes them more dangerous." Catherine closed the journal and wrapped it carefully in its protective covering. "Then, we'd better make sure they don't find us before we can get this evidence to the right people." As they prepared to leave their hiding place, Catherine realized that she now carried more than just her father's legacy. She carried the means to protect countless other families from the kind of pain and fear that had shaped her own childhood. The question was whether she would prove worthy of the trust her father had placed in her. Catherine and Cyrus were preparing to leave the hidden chamber when the sound of approaching horses froze them in place. Through the gap in the rocks, they watched as a fourth man rode into the valley, older than the others, moving with the confidence of someone accustomed to command. Even from a distance, Catherine could see that this newcomer changed the entire dynamic of the group below. "Marcus Reynolds," Cyrus said grimly. "I was hoping we'd have more time." The man dismounting near the Brenger cabin was in his 60s, well-dressed despite the rough conditions, with silver hair and the kind of presence that commanded attention. Catherine watched him survey the scene with calculating eyes, taking in the evidence of his men's frustrated search with obvious displeasure. "He doesn't look like a criminal," she whispered. "The worst ones never do," Cyrus replied. "Reynolds built his empire by appearing respectable, while others did his dirty work. Your father spent years trying to prove what everyone suspected, but couldn't prove." As they watched, Reynolds gathered his men around him, speaking in tones too low to carry, but with gestures that clearly communicated both authority and urgency. Within minutes, the searchers had organized themselves into a more systematic pattern, spreading out across the valley with military precision. "We need to move," Cyrus said, but Catherine was studying something in her father's journal that made her hesitate. "Wait," she said, reading one of the final entries. "There's something here about Reynolds that doesn't make sense." The entry was dated just weeks before her father's death. "Final contact with MR. Confirms suspicions. Not the original enemy, son carrying father's grudge. Real Marcus Reynolds died in Mexico, 1889. This one is Marcus Reynolds Jr., age 34, seeking father's lost fortune supposedly hidden at my location. Doesn't know fortune never existed, father lost everything before death. Son believes cabin contains money that was never there. Perfect opportunity to end threat while protecting evidence." Catherine read the passage twice, her understanding of the situation shifting dramatically. "Cyrus, the man down there, he's not the same Marcus Reynolds who threatened our family 30 years ago." "What do you mean?" "He's the son. The original Reynolds died years ago, but his son believes my father stole money that never existed in the first place." Catherine turned to a map in the journal that showed various cache locations. "My father has been planning this confrontation, but not the way we thought. He wasn't just setting a trap, he was setting up a resolution." The implications hit her like a physical blow. Her father's final plan wasn't about continuing an endless cycle of violence and revenge. It was about ending it by exposing the truth and ensuring that no one else would be threatened by the Reynolds name. "Look at this," she said, pointing to another section of the journal. "My father has been tracking the younger Reynolds for years, documenting his crimes, building a case against him. But more than that, he's been creating a situation where Reynolds would come here voluntarily, bringing evidence of his own criminal activities." Cyrus studied the pages, Catherine indicated, his weathered face showing growing understanding and admiration. Ben was always thinking 3 steps ahead, but this is strategy on a completely different level. Catherine continued, reading, discovering that her father had spent his final years carefully orchestrating a scenario where justice could be served without requiring her to live in fear for the rest of her life. Every cache, every hidden clue, every piece of evidence had been positioned not just to document Reynolds's crimes, but to ensure he would be caught in the act of committing new ones. "He knew I would come here," she realized, "and he knew Reynolds would follow. But he also knew that when it was over, I would have everything needed to end this threat permanently." A shout from the valley below interrupted her revelation. One of the searchers had found something, not the main journal, but one of her father's secondary caches. Catherine watched as the man carried a waterproof container to Reynolds, who opened it with obvious anticipation. Even from their distance, she could see Reynolds' reaction to whatever he found inside. His posture straightened, and he began issuing rapid orders to his men. Whatever her father had left in that cache had convinced Reynolds that the main prize was within reach. "What did he find?" Cyrus asked. Catherine consulted her father's maps and notes. According to this, it's a partial financial record enough to suggest that there really is money hidden here, but incomplete enough to require the main journal to make sense of it. Your father left them bait. More than that. He left them evidence of their own crimes. Catherine pointed to a detailed note in the margin. That cache contains records of recent robberies that only someone involved in Reynolds' current organization would know about. By taking it, Reynolds is incriminating himself. As they watched, Reynolds divided his men into two groups, one to continue searching the cabin area, another to begin expanding the search perimeter. It was clear that their hiding place would be discovered within hours, possibly minutes. "Catherine," Cyrus said urgently, "we need to decide what we're going to do. We can try to slip away and get this evidence to the authorities, or we can finish what my father started," Catherine said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. "Look at this final page." The last entry in her father's journal was addressed directly to her. "Katie, if you're reading this, then everything has gone according to plan. Reynolds is here, searching for money that doesn't exist while providing evidence of crimes that will put him away forever. But the choice of what happens next is yours. You can take what you've learned and trust others to handle the justice, or you can step into the role I've been preparing you for. I've left everything you need to end this safely, but the decision must be yours. Whatever you choose, know that I'm proud of you and that you're stronger than you know. Your father, who never stopped believing in you." Below the entry was a detailed map of the cabin area, showing defensive positions, hidden weapons caches, and strategic advantages that her father had spent years preparing. It was clear that he had designed this location not just as a hiding place, but as a fortress where a smart, determined person could hold off multiple attackers while the authorities were summoned. "He prepared for me to make a stand here," Catherine said, studying the tactical notes with growing understanding. Every modification to this area, every hidden advantage, it was all designed for someone who would need to defend this position until help arrived. A rifle shot echoed across the valley, followed by shouts. Looking toward the cabin, they could see that Reynolds' men had found their horses' tracks and were now actively hunting for their location. "They know we're here," Cyrus said, checking his rifle with practiced efficiency. "Time to choose, Catherine." Catherine looked at her father's journal, then at the defensive positions he had marked on his map, then at the evidence that could finally bring justice for all the families Reynolds had destroyed. For 30 years, she had lived with the consequences of her father's choices. Now, it was time to make her own. "We finish it here," she said, her voice carrying a strength that surprised them both. "We finish it the way my father planned." Catherine and Cyrus moved quickly but carefully back toward the cabin area, using the defensive route her father had mapped out in meticulous detail. Every few hundred yards, the journal indicated hidden supply caches, and Catherine found herself amazed at the thoroughness of her father's preparations. This wasn't the work of a broken man hiding from his problems. This was the strategic planning of a soldier who had never stopped fighting for what he believed in. The first cache they reached contained weapons wrapped in oiled cloth, ammunition, and a leather pouch with Catherine's name written in her father's careful script. Inside, the pouch was a letter she had been meant to read only at this moment. "Katie, if you're reading this, then you've chosen to stand and fight rather than run and hide. I'm proud of you, though I pray you never have to prove that courage. The men coming for you believe strength comes from intimidation and violence. They're wrong. Real strength comes from protecting others, from standing up for what's right even when it's dangerous. You have that strength, daughter. You've always had it. What you'll find here will help you use it. Trust Cyrus. Trust your instincts, and remember that sometimes the only way to end a cycle of violence is to be willing to fight for peace. Your father, who believes in you completely." Underneath the letter was something that made Catherine's breath catch a rifle that had clearly been modified and customized specifically for her. The stock was carved with her initials, and the weapon was perfectly balanced for someone of her height and build. Her father had spent years preparing not just a strategy, but the tools she would need to execute it. He knew, she said wonderingly, lifting the rifle and finding it felt natural in her hands, despite her complete lack of experience with firearms. Somehow, he knew I would choose to fight. Ben always said you had the heart of a warrior, Cyrus replied, checking his own weapon with practiced efficiency. He just hoped you'd never have to prove it. They continued moving through the forest, staying well ahead of their pursuers, while Cyrus explained the defensive positions her father had prepared. The cabin wasn't just a home, it was the center of an elaborate fortress designed to allow a small force to hold off a larger one indefinitely. The water source is protected and can't be cut off, Cyrus explained, pointing to a natural spring that bubbled up behind the cabin. Food supplies are cached in multiple locations. Most importantly, there are only 3 approaches that don't leave attackers completely exposed, and your father designed overlapping fields of fire to cover all of them. Catherine studied her father's tactical notes, understanding for the first time why he had chosen this particular location. From a military perspective, it was nearly perfect, easily defended, difficult to approach, with multiple escape routes if retreat became necessary. "How long can we hold out?" she asked. "Long enough," Cyrus said with confidence. "Your father included plans for getting word to the territorial marshal. Once the authorities know what's happening here, Reynolds and his men will have bigger problems than finding money that doesn't exist." As they reached the final cache before the cabin area, Catherine discovered that her father had prepared for contingencies she couldn't have imagined. Along with weapons and ammunition, he had left detailed instructions for various scenarios, including how to signal for help and where to find evidence that would be safe, even if the cabin was destroyed. He thought of everything, she marveled, reading through plans that covered every possible outcome of the coming confrontation. Ben spent his final years doing nothing but thinking about this day, Cyrus said. He knew that eventually someone would come looking for him, and he wanted to make sure that when they did, it would end the threat permanently, rather than just postponing it. The sound of voices in the distance indicated that Reynolds and his men were getting closer. Catherine could hear them calling to each other as they spread out through the forest, their search pattern becoming more systematic and thorough. "They'll find our trail soon," Cyrus observed. "We need to reach the cabin and get into position." As they approached the final stretch of forest, before the clearing, Catherine felt a strange calm settling over her. For 30 years, she had lived with the shadow of her father's choices hanging over her life. She had wondered if she was strong enough, brave enough, good enough to be worthy of the sacrifices he had made. Now, finally, she was about to find out. The cabin looked different when seen through the lens of her father's tactical planning. What had appeared to be a simple mountain dwelling was actually a carefully designed stronghold. The placement of every window, every door, every piece of furniture had been planned with defense in mind. "Your father spent his final years turning this place into a fortress," Cyrus said as they reached the tree line. "But more than that, he turned it into a symbol. Whatever happens here today, it represents the choice between justice and revenge, between protecting the innocent and perpetuating cycles of violence." Catherine looked toward the cabin, where Reynolds and his men had made themselves at home, completely unaware that they were about to walk into a trap 30 years in the making. Her father had orchestrated this confrontation with the precision of a master strategist, but he had also ensured that the final choice, how it ended, would be hers to make. "There's one more thing," Cyrus said, pulling a badge from his pocket. It was a simple tin star, worn and tarnished with age, but bearing the inscription, "Deputy Marshal, Territory of Colorado." "Your father's commission," Cyrus explained. "The territorial marshal deputized him years ago, recognizing the work he was doing to protect isolated communities. Everything he did, every action he took, was legal and sanctioned by legitimate authority." Catherine took the badge, feeling its weight in her palm. Her father hadn't been a vigilante operating outside the law. He had been a lawman, working to protect people the regular authorities couldn't reach. That makes you his heir in more ways than just property, Cyrus continued. By law and by right, you have the authority to arrest Reynolds and his men for their crimes. I'm not a deputy marshal, Catherine protested. Your father's commission was hereditary, Cyrus said with a slight smile. One of the peculiarities of territorial law. As his daughter and heir, you have the legal right to act with his authority. Catherine stared at the badge, understanding finally dawning. Her father's final plan wasn't just about justice. It was about ensuring that justice was served through proper legal channels, with legitimate authority, in a way that would stand up to any scrutiny. He planned for me to arrest them, she said wonderingly. He planned for you to have the choice, Cyrus corrected. The authority to act, the means to act, and the support to see it through. But the decision of how to use that authority that's yours to make. As the sun began to set behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the clearing, Catherine pinned her father's badge to her shirt and checked the rifle he had crafted specifically for her hands. Tomorrow, she would either validate his faith in her strength and judgment, or she would fail in the most important test of her life. But tonight, for the first time in 30 years, Catherine Brennan felt like her father's daughter, not the abandoned child she had believed herself to be, but the rightful heir to a legacy of courage, justice, and unwavering dedication to protecting the innocent. The final confrontation was hours away, and she was as ready for it as any person could be. Dawn came with gunfire. Catherine woke to the sound of splintering wood as bullets punched through the cabin's shutters. She and Cyrus had spent the night in her father's carefully prepared defensive positions, and the attack came exactly as his tactical notes had predicted, a coordinated assault designed to overwhelm the cabin's defenders through sheer volume of fire. But her father had planned for this too. Catherine rolled to the rifle port he had carved into the cabin's eastern wall, finding the custom weapon he had made for her, already loaded and ready. Through the narrow opening, she could see Reynolds' men, advancing across the clearing in a pattern that exposed them to the overlapping fields of fire her father had designed into the cabin's defenses. Remember, Cyrus called from his own position, they think they're attacking a helpless woman and an old man. They have no idea what your father prepared for this moment. Catherine sighted down the rifle barrel, her hands steady despite the fear coursing through her. Her father's weapon felt perfectly balanced in her grip, as if it had been waiting 30 years for this moment. When she squeezed the trigger, the recoil was manageable, and she watched one of the attackers dive for cover behind a boulder that her father's notes had specifically mentioned. "Warning shots," she called out, following her father's detailed instructions. "I'm Deputy Marshal Catherine Brennan, and you men are under arrest for trespassing, theft, and conspiracy to commit robbery. Surrender your weapons, and you won't be harmed." Reynolds' voice carried clearly across the clearing, filled with contempt and disbelief. "Deputy Marshal, you're Benjamin Brennan's little girl, nothing more. And when we're done here, you'll tell us where your daddy hid our money." Catherine's response was another carefully aimed shot that sent Reynolds scrambling for better cover. "There is no money, Mr. Reynolds. There never was. What my father left here is evidence that will put you and your men in prison for the rest of your lives." The next volley of gunfire was more concentrated, focused on the cabin's main door and windows. But her father's modifications held firm. The shutters were reinforced with iron plates, and the walls themselves had been thickened with additional logs and stone. What looked like a simple mountain cabin was actually a fortress built to withstand exactly this kind of assault. Catherine moved to a second rifle port, following the rotation pattern her father had outlined in his notes. From this position, she could see Reynolds himself, crouched behind a fallen tree, with a clear view of his tactical situation. For the first time, she could see uncertainty in his posture. This wasn't going according to his plan. "Your father was always too clever for his own good," Reynolds shouted. "But he's dead, girl, and you're outnumbered 3-1. This can end easy or hard, your choice." 4-1, Catherine called back, remembering her father's psychological warfare notes. But you're right about one thing, this ends today. The question is whether you surrender now or wait for the territorial marshal to arrive with a full posse. It was a bluff, but delivered with the confidence her father had taught her through his detailed instructions. The key was making Reynolds believe that help was already on the way, that this cabin was not the isolated target he had expected. Cyrus opened fire from the cabin's western wall, his shots perfectly timed to support Catherine's psychological pressure. The coordination between them was seamless, exactly as her father had planned, making their small force seem larger and more organized than it actually was. Catherine heard one of Reynolds' men call out in frustration, "Boss, this ain't what you said it would be. They're dug in good, and that girl knows how to shoot." "Shut up and keep firing," Reynolds snapped back, but Catherine could hear the strain in his voice. This confrontation was revealing him as a man who relied on intimidation and superior numbers rather than tactical skill or personal courage. Another coordinated volley from the attackers splintered more wood and sent bullets ricocheting through the cabin, but Catherine found herself calmer than she would have expected. Her father's preparations were holding, his strategy was working, and for the first time in her life, she felt truly connected to the strength he had always believed she possessed. "Mr. Reynolds," she called during a lull in the firing, "my father left detailed records of all your activities. Bank robberies, attacks on settlers, extortion schemes, everything. The only question now is whether you'll face justice alive or dead." The silence that followed her words stretched longer than the previous pauses. Catherine could sense that Reynolds was reassessing his situation, realizing that this was not the easy prize he had expected. When the next attack came, it was desperate rather than confident, the actions of men who knew their situation was deteriorating rapidly. But Catherine was ready for it, and her father's defensive preparations had only begun to reveal their true effectiveness. The second phase of the battle began when Reynolds realized that brute force wouldn't work against her father's preparations. Catherine watched through her rifle port as he gathered his men for what appeared to be a strategic conference, their voices too low to carry, but their gestures increasingly agitated. "They're running out of ammunition," Cyrus observed from his position. "Your father calculated their likely supply based on what they could carry on horseback. They're probably down to their last few rounds." Catherine felt a surge of admiration for her father's thoroughness. Even in death, he was still protecting her, still thinking several steps ahead of their enemies. She reached for the badge he had left her, drawing strength from its weight against her chest. "Mr. Reynolds," she called out, "you have one chance to surrender before this gets worse for you. Throw down your weapons and step into the clearing with your hands visible." Reynolds' response was a frustrated roar of anger. "I've been hunting your father for 30 years, girl. I'm not going to be stopped by his whelp and a broken-down old cowboy." But Catherine could hear the desperation beneath his bravado. This wasn't going according to any plan Reynolds had made, and his men were clearly losing confidence in his leadership. The next attack was Reynolds' most desperate gambit, a direct assault on the cabin's front door, while his remaining men provided covering fire from opposite sides of the clearing. But Catherine's father had anticipated even this strategy, and she found detailed instructions for exactly this scenario. Moving to the rifle port that commanded the best view of the cabin's entrance, Catherine waited until Reynolds was halfway across the clearing before taking her shot. The bullet struck the ground inches from his feet, sending him diving for cover behind a pile of firewood that her father's notes had specifically mentioned as inadequate protection. "That was your warning shot, Mr. Reynolds," Catherine called out, chambering another round with smooth precision. "The next one won't miss." From her elevated position, she could see Reynolds clearly, despite his attempts at concealment. Her father's weapon was perfectly zeroed for this exact range and angle, and she realized that he had spent countless hours practicing for this moment, ensuring that anyone using his rifle from his defensive positions would have every possible advantage. "Boss," one of Reynolds' men shouted, "I'm out of ammunition, and I can see riders coming up the valley." Catherine's heart leaped. The riders were too far away to identify, but their presence changed everything about the tactical situation. Reynolds had to know that his window of opportunity was rapidly closing. "Mr. Reynolds," she called again, "those riders are territorial marshals responding to the distress signal my father arranged. You have about 10 minutes to surrender before this becomes a federal matter." It was another bluff. She had no idea who the approaching riders were, but the effect on Reynolds was immediate. She watched him scan the valley, see the distant figures, and realized that his careful plan was collapsing around him. "All right," Reynolds called out, his voice carrying a defeat that hadn't been there minutes earlier. "All right, we're coming out. Don't shoot." Catherine kept her rifle trained on the clearing as Reynolds and his 2 remaining men emerged from their positions with their hands raised. But her father's tactical notes had warned her about trusting surrenders from desperate men, and she maintained her defensive posture. "Drop your weapons," she commanded. "All of them, including any hideout guns you think I can't see." The men complied reluctantly, placing revolvers, knives, and a small derringer on the ground before stepping back with their hands raised. Catherine felt a moment of pure triumph as she realized that she had done what seemed impossible, captured her father's enemies using his own carefully planned strategy. But the moment of victory was interrupted by Reynolds' bitter laughter. "You think this ends anything, girl? You think arresting me stops what I've built? I have men in 3 territories who'll come looking for what your father stole from us." Catherine stepped out of the cabin for the first time since the battle began, her father's rifle held with confident authority and his badge glinting in the morning sunlight. "My father didn't steal anything from you, Mr. Reynolds, but I have 30 years of evidence documenting what you stole from innocent families. And those riders approaching? They're carrying federal warrants for your arrest." Reynolds' face went pale as the full scope of his situation became clear. This wasn't just about money or revenge. It was about justice finally being served after decades of his crimes going unpunished. "Your father's dead," Reynolds said, but his voice lacked conviction now. "Yes," Catherine agreed, looking toward the approaching riders with growing confidence. "But his work lives on, and it's finally finished." As the riders entered the clearing, Catherine saw the unmistakable glint of federal badges and felt her father's presence as surely as if he were standing beside her, proud of the daughter who had proven herself worthy of his legacy. 3 months later, Catherine stood in the doorway of her father's cabin, watching the sun rise over the Colorado mountains. The structure bore scars from the battle bullet holes that she had decided to leave unrepaired as reminders of the day she finally understood who her father really was and who she was meant to become. The federal marshals had indeed been responding to her father's carefully planned distress signal, triggered by a mechanism he had designed to activate when the cabin came under sustained attack. Even in death, Benjamin Brennan had been protecting his daughter, ensuring that help would arrive exactly when she needed it most. Marcus Reynolds, Jr. was now serving a life sentence in federal prison, convicted on evidence her father had spent decades collecting. His organization had been dismantled completely, with dozens of arrests across 3 territories. The families who had suffered under his father's and his own criminal enterprise finally had justice, and the communities they had terrorized were finally safe. But more importantly to Catherine, she had discovered her father's book of remembrance, a leather-bound journal he had kept throughout his years of service, documenting every family he had helped, every community he had protected, every small victory in his private war against those who preyed on the innocent. The journal's final pages were blank, except for a heading written in her father's careful script. Catherine's chapter. She had begun filling those pages with her own stories. Catherine's life in Denver was over. She had resigned from the library, sold her small apartment, and used the proceeds to establish the Brennan Foundation, an organization dedicated to helping families threatened by criminal organizations. The cabin had become her headquarters, but more than that, it had become a refuge for women and children fleeing dangerous situations. Cyrus had stayed on as her partner and advisor, his knowledge of the mountains and his connections with law enforcement proving invaluable as Catherine learned to navigate her new role. The gruff mountain man had become the grandfather figure she had never known she needed, patient with her questions and generous with his hard-won wisdom. "You've got visitors coming up the trail," he called from where he was repairing the corral fence. 3 riders, moving careful-like. Catherine picked up the binoculars her father had left among his equipment and studied the approaching figures. A woman and 2 children, all mounted on horses that showed signs of hard travel. The woman rode with the tense alertness of someone constantly watching for pursuit. "Another family needing sanctuary," Catherine said, recognizing the signs she had learned to read over the past months. This was her life now, providing the same kind of protection her father had offered, but in a more organized and legal fashion. The territorial marshal had officially recognized her inherited commission, and she worked closely with federal authorities to ensure that her methods stayed within the bounds of law. As the riders approached the cabin, Catherine could see that the woman was perhaps 40, with prematurely grey hair and the hollow-eyed look of someone who had been running for a long time. The children, a boy and girl of perhaps 10 and 12, clung to their saddles with the exhaustion of a journey that had pushed them beyond their limits. "Ma'am," Catherine called out, walking into the clearing with her hands visible and non-threatening. "I'm Deputy Marshal Catherine Brennan. Are you looking for sanctuary?" The woman's relief was immediate and overwhelming. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking with emotion. "We've been riding for 5 days. The men who killed my husband, they're still following us." Catherine helped the family dismount and settle their horses, her movements efficient and calming. This was routine now, as familiar as cataloging books had once been, but infinitely more meaningful. "You're safe here," she assured the woman. "My name is Catherine, and this place is designed specifically to protect families like yours." "Cyrus," she gestured to the older man, approaching with blankets and water, "will take care of your immediate needs while I prepare the appropriate legal documents." As Catherine watched the children's fear begin to gain ease in the security of the cabin's protected environment, she thought about the letter her father had left for this moment, not the one she had found in his cache, but the one she had discovered just last week while organizing his personal effects. "Katie, if you're reading this, then you've found your true calling. You've discovered that protecting others isn't just work, it's purpose. I always knew you had the strength for this, even when you doubted it yourself. The cabin is yours now, along with everything I built here. Use it wisely. Use it well, and know that every family you save validates every sacrifice I made. You are my greatest achievement, my daughter, and I'm proud beyond measure of the woman you've become. Keep the badge polished, keep the rifle clean, and never forget that love sometimes requires us to stand between those we care about and the darkness that would harm them." Your father, who finally came home. Catherine touched the badge on her shirt, the same tin star her father had worn for decades, now polished to a bright shine and worn with the authority of someone who had earned the right to carry it. In the distance, she could see more riders approaching federal marshals, responding to the message she had sent about the new family's situation. The men pursuing this woman and her children would find themselves facing not just a determined protector, but the full weight of legitimate law enforcement. This was her father's true legacy, not the property he had left her, but the purpose he had shown at her. Catherine Brennan was no longer the abandoned daughter of a broken drunk. She was the rightful heir to a tradition of courage, justice, and unwavering dedication to protecting those who couldn't protect themselves, and she was finally, truly, home.